Okay. Oh, and I wanted to, how do I? Okay, so today is Berkeley's treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. Buckle up, people. It's gonna get weird. So before we start, let's go back to the chart. Right, this is the class as we've had it up until this point. Right, remember we have our distinction in epistemology between the rationalists and the empiricists, and then we've got our distinction metaphysically between the dualists and the monists. So the rationalists are those who think that the foundation for all human knowledge is pure reason. The empiricists think that the basis for all human knowledge is sense perception. The dualists argue that reality has a dual nature, that there are two different kinds of stuff in reality, mind and body. The monists say, no, there's only one kind. And some say it's mind, some say it's body, some say it's some other thing, that mind and body are just aspects of. And the point to take from everything we've done so far is that commitment in one, of a dualist who's a rationalist and a dualist who's an empiricist. We have a couple of rationalists who are monists. Well, could you be an empiricist and a monist? And that is what brings us to Berkeley. So Bishop George Berkeley, there's the classic portrait of him. 1685 to 1753. So again, roughly the same period as all the other figures. These guys are reading each other. Many of them know each other, right? Europe is a small place at this point. He had a day job. He was a bishop, the Bishop of Cloyne, which is in Ireland. He was an Anglican bishop in Ireland. Ireland, of course, is very Catholic. And so as an Anglican bishop, that left him not a whole lot to do, which gave him lots and lots of time for his other pursuits. His works, primarily in philosophy, but he does some work in anatomy, looking at the notion of vision, does some work in physics and in mathematics. And the math and physics, interestingly, is largely negative work, right? He's attacking the work of a very prominent British thinker, and that is Isaac Newton. So he, for whatever reason, takes on Newton as his opponent, and he objects to Newton both in terms of his physics and the mathematics that he develops. He argues that gravity does not exist. And part of what we'll see is the reason he does this is he takes his epistemology very, very seriously, right? You'll remember with Spinoza, right? Spinoza argues against Descartes, saying that Descartes started out being a rationalist, but he refused to go all the way. And so what we get is the strangeness of Spinoza, that there is only one thing and it's God, and God is everything and everything is a mode, right, comes from taking the epistemology seriously and seeing how far it goes when we lead it to its logical conclusion. Well, Berkeley does the same thing with empiricism. He wants to say that a thing is only if it's observable, right? That invisible things aren't real. Something that is beyond the reach of the senses isn't real. And what does Newton say? Newton says that space is an object. Space is a thing. Well, can you see space? No. Can you feel space? No. Similarly, gravity. Berkeley will say it's clear that things fall and there's a regularity that governs their falling, but the idea of a force, can you see gravity? Can you touch gravity? No. And so he wants to argue contra Newton that the whole notion of gravity is just nonsense. He also attacks the calculus, right? And this is a part that probably bothered a whole lot of us when we first learned it in high school, right? And that is that, in essence, you're dividing by zero, right? That the infinitesimal is infinitesimally small, and when you put it on the bottom, well, anything divided by zero is meaningless, right? You can't divide a pizza into zero slices. And so what Berkeley argues is that Newton's calculus is intellectually flawed at the foundations. And the problem ultimately is resolved in the 19th century by Euler when he comes up with the notion of limits. But it was Berkeley who really hammered the problem, and claiming then that the entire tool of the calculus was, in fact, not to be used, that it was illegitimate. His best-selling book, interestingly, had nothing to do with philosophy. It was a self-help book that he wrote, in which he effects of tar water. What is tar water? Exactly what it sounds like. Water with tar in it. So it turns out that if you take pine tar, there is some chemical in it that is, I don't know if it's an antibacterial, but if you put pine tar on a wound, it will actually heal better. And so, much like a recent politician reasoned with respect to coronavirus and bleach, well, look, if bleach kills the virus, why don't we start drinking it? It'll make us healthier. Well, if applying tar to wounds allows them to heal better, why don't we start drinking tar water? And so he wrote an entire book advising people to drink tar water, which in fact does not have the health promoting, or says it'll stick you up inside real good. Interestingly, he is one of the very few philosophers of this period who came to America. He, as an Anglican priest, was able to get married, and he and his young wife came to the United States. They lived for a while in Rhode Island. The house where he lived, he actually had a house built, still exists. It's a Berkeley museum. I've yet to go. Maybe we'll take a field trip someday. But while here, he was an esteemed and prominent visitor. You got to remember that, at this period, the U.S. was the sort of, and notice the date, these were the British colonies at that point, we weren't even a country, was a complete backwoods. And so somebody of his stature, it was a huge deal. And he was a proponent of what would ultimately come to be called manifest destiny. And he is the one who uttered the famous phrase, "Go west, young man." And as a result, there are a number of things, especially west of the East Coast, that are named for him. Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, Berkeley, California, both Bishop George Berkeley. And again, in England, the ER is often pronounced like we pronounce an AR. So it is spelled Berkeley, but pronounced Barclay. Now, when he was here, one of the things he was doing, being a university in the New World, he wanted to locate it on the island of Bermuda, a fine place for a university. And what was especially interesting about it is that half of the student body would be brought over from Europe. The other half would be those who were natively from the Caribbean. So the idea being that, you often have this idea in colonial powers that, there is a sort of inherent superiority to their sorts of folks. Berkeley clearly thought that anyone could be educated and that the education of all would be well served if they were educated together. So there was a definite progressive streak in that sense. So that's Berkeley. So let's start the text. And he starts with one of the most wonderful passages in all of philosophy, right? You think philosophy is a good thing, right? Well, here's what Berkeley says. Philosophy being nothing else but the study of wisdom and truth, it may, with reason, be expected that those who have spent the most time and pains in it should enjoy a greater calm and serenity of mind, a greater clearness and evidence of knowledge, and be less disturbed with doubts and difficulties than other men. Yet so it is, we see, the illiterate bulk of mankind who walk the high road of plain common sense and are governed by the dictates of nature, for the most part, easy and undisturbed. To them, nothing that's familiar appears unaccountable or difficult to comprehend. They don't complain of any want of evidence in their senses and are out of all danger of becoming skeptics. So the point is that most people don't have the sorts of worries that philosophers have. You'd think that philosophers would do away with the worries. No, philosophy actually makes it worse. Now, who is the target of this? He's clearly mocking somebody, and that somebody is obviously Descartes, right? The idea of being a skeptic and doubting your senses, right? What Descartes is doing in the Meditations is, he wants to say, patently absurd. And if you ask any common person, they will realize immediately that this philosophy stuff is just silly nonsense. And so he's going to argue it is. And he continues in the first several sections, as a good empiricist, to attack the arch rationalist Descartes all the way through 5, but especially in 2 and 3, right? He's clearly talking about Descartes. And the fun part of reading Berkeley is you can't read him without really feeling the snark, the sarcasm, right? He is a very sarcastic, dismissive kind of guy, and it makes it kind of fun, right? He says here, my purpose, therefore, is to try if I could discover what those principles are which have introduced all that doubtfulness and uncertainty, right? Those absurdities and contradictions into the several sects of philosophy, inasmuch as the wisest men have thought our ignorance incurable, conceiving it to arise from the natural dullness and limitations of our faculties. Right? So Descartes, with his methodological skepticism, right, tries to do all this smart work, and all he gets led to is, a sort of trap where it seems like we can't believe anything, and we're led to doubt our senses. We're led to doubt our reason. Berkeley's not that impressed. He says, if you look at Descartes, and not only Descartes, what you will notice in the work of almost all philosophers is the move to abstraction. In the sense, they are arguing that philosophy is the study of abstraction. He writes, he who is not a perfect stranger to the writings and disputes of philosophers must necessarily acknowledge that no small part of them are spent about abstract ideas. These are, in a more special manner, thought to be the object of those sciences which go by the name of logic and metaphysics, and all which passes under the notion of the most abstracted and sublime learning, in all of which one shall scarce find any question handled in such a manner that does not suppose their existence in the mind, and that is well acquainted with them. So most philosophers, Berkeley wants to argue, hold that philosophy really is the study of concepts, notions, abstractions, ideas, right? Who is this? Well, the big name, obviously, is Plato, right? What does Plato say is real? The forms, and the forms are perfect ideas that you glimpse in the world of forms using the eye of the mind, right? For Aristotle, he brings philosophy back to the world, but he does it in a way that still makes use of forms. He terms essences, right? The eternal underlying nature of the thing, right? And that you have various species, whether it's species of artifact or natural species, right? And that's where the telos, the aim, the goal, the potential of the thing is held. And so if you really want understanding and knowledge about the real world, Aristotle argues, and unlike Plato, he's going to hold the real world is the real world, but the real knowledge of that real world is still conceptual knowledge. And it's not only the ancients, it's not only the classical Greeks, but he's going to say Descartes and especially John Locke. And Locke, you're going to see, is a major target. Why would one empiricist be taking on another empiricist? Because he's saying that in a certain sense, he's a traitor to empiricism, back on real empiricism, and sell out to the rationalists, right? We had this debate between the rationalists and the empiricists over the foundation of human knowledge. And what Berkeley wants to say is that the great empiricist, the most famous empiricist, Locke, hasn't done us a service. He's conceded too much to the enemy, right? He says, look, according to Locke, right? Think back a couple lectures ago, a couple readings ago, right? Remember what Locke says. Locke says that when we perceive the world, we perceive it through our senses, and the senses bring in simple ideas, right? So if there's a lemon in front of us, right, we don't just see a lemon. We see yellow, we see bumpy, we see oblong, we feel bumpy, we smell that lemony, citrusy smell, we taste the sour, right? What comes in are individual simple ideas, and then in an activity of the mind, out of all of the pieces. So we don't just observe a lemon, we observe all of the properties. And then the brain, the mind, right? Remember, there is a difference back then. The mind takes all of those properties and combines them into a complex idea of lemon. But we don't see a lemon, we see all the properties and we build the lemon. And so the idea here is that what we perceive are these abstract concepts of yellowness, bumpiness, sourness, oblongity. And his response is, yeah, no. He argues this: whether others have this wonderful faculty of abstracting their ideas, they can best tell. For myself, I find indeed I have a faculty of imagining or representing to myself the ideas of those particular things I've perceived and of variously compounding and dividing them. I can imagine a man with two heads, or the upper part of a man joined to the body of a horse. I can consider the hand, the eye, the nose, each by itself abstracted or separated from the rest of the body. But whatever hand or eye I imagine, it must have some particular shape and color. Likewise, the idea of a man that I frame to myself must either be a white, a black, or a tawny, a straight or a crooked, a tall, a short, a middle-sized man. I cannot, by any effort of thought, conceive idea above described. The idea here is, he's saying, look, maybe you people are so brilliant that, you perceive abstract ideas. Me? I don't know. I just see things. I see lemons. I see people. I see chairs, right? The idea here, he says, is I can't even conceive in my mind of what these concepts are, right? We think in particulars. Why? Because we observe particulars. You don't observe humanity. You observe a person, a particular person. And when you think of a person, you have to think of a particular person, right? Take the concept dog. We all know what dog means. But do you think of canineness? No. You think of a dog. What breed is it? You can't think of a dog independent of a breed, right? What color is it, right? The idea here is we don't have, he wants to say, these sorts of abstract ideas. We always deal in the particular. Philosophy, these guys all want to argue, is about, it's in essence the science of abstraction. He wants to say that abstraction isn't even possible. Does this destroy philosophy? Well, he's going to say it's a problem, right? And he's going to say that the person he most thinks ought to save us from that problem, in fact, only entrenches the problem further, and that's John Locke, right? So the beginning of this work clearly is aimed at Descartes, and that's not surprising because empiricists are going to attack rationalists, right? That's just part of the game. but his real target is John Locke, right? He thinks he's just giving too much away, right? In the same way that Spinoza was criticizing Descartes for not being a pure rationalist, right? Only going halfway, not, if you're going to be a rationalist, be a rationalist. It's going to argue that Locke is like Descartes in the sense that Locke is an empiricist, but he's only going there halfway. We need to go all the way. If we're going to commit to empiricism, let's commit to empiricism. Let's be empiricists all the way. And he says, I readily agree with this learned author, and the learned author is Locke, that the faculty of brutes, that is mere animals, can by means attain should be by no means attain to abstraction. But then, if this is made the distinguishing property of that sort of animal, I fear a great many of those must be reckoned in their numbers, right? The idea here is, yeah, I will grant, along with Locke, that animals don't have access to abstraction. Locke wants to say that's the difference between humans and animals. Berkeley's going to say, if that's really the difference. Now, we do talk in general terms, right? We do talk about humans. We do talk about triangles. We do talk about the color yellow. But he says that's where the misunderstanding occurs, right? Locke contends that we move from the particular to the abstract when we construct words, because words have definitions that are general. Philosophy, and this is both metaphysical thought and natural philosophy or science, right? In those days, they were combined into one study, is done in words, right? You have to have language in order to discuss philosophy. So philosophy is always done in of language. And what he argues is that the move from the observation to the word about the observation is the move from particularity to abstraction, right? So you may see somebody wearing a purple shirt, and so you see that particular purple. Or if you look at this PowerPoint, right? Up top, the heading is purple, right? And so there is a direct connection between the outside world and your mind. And in your mind now, remember, for him, it's a secondary quality. We'll get to that, right? In your mind now is the idea of purple. But the difference between the idea, the perception that you have looking at the purpleness, the purplity of the banner up at the top of the slide is different from the word purple. The word purple, in order to have meaning, to be useful as a word, has to have a definition, and that definition requires us to abstract the notion of purplitude, right? Is that purple itself becomes conceptual, becomes abstract, the minute we are able to use a word to label it. Right? And philosophy then is the study of the nature and aspects of these abstract notions. So you can't do philosophy without language, but the existence of language itself signals the philosophical project that needs to be done. Language creates ideas, necessitates ideas, and the analysis of those ideas is what philosophy is. Is Berkeley going to buy that? Of course not. He says, but to this I cannot assent. For it seems that a word becomes general by being made the sign, not of an abstract general idea, but of several particular ideas, any one of them it indifferently suggests to the mind. Right? The idea here, he says, is that when I talk about purple, what I'm not doing is talking about the abstract principle of that which partakes of the purplesque, right? In fact, what I'm talking about is the set of all purple things, right? For those of you who took my analytic philosophy class, he's drawing the distinction here, not dissimilar to Frege, between sense and reference, right? There's the intention the abstract concept that can be used to determine whether something is in the set or out of the set, versus the extension, the reference, that is the set of things that embody that term, right? And what Berkeley is saying is that this intention is the sort of abstraction, but that's not real. What's real is the extension, the set of all purple things, right? And those are particulars. And so it's a set of objects. So what do I mean by purple? I mean all the purple things. Now, in science, the use of general terms, and the example he uses is acceleration. Right? He uses increase in motion. That was just the Newtonian way of saying acceleration, right? So the use of these general terms doesn't abstract the notion away from the physical system, but just covers the instances within the physical system, that is, things that accelerate. One of the things that Berkeley had a problem with is Newton's use of the concept of force, right? What exactly is a force? It's sort of this magical, invisible thing. Now, if you're just using it as a correlation between mass, which is observable, and acceleration, which is observable, it's fine. But don't think that it's some real metaphysical entity. It isn't. There is no abstract notion of force in the world. There is just the correlation of observable things. And so when we make a term meaningful, we are making it general. That is, we are talking about a set of objects that it describes. But the property requires the objects to have them. It requires something observable in the world. General is not the same as abstract. And he says, you know, look, let's talk about triangles, right? He asks, can you think of a triangle that is neither oblique nor rectangular? By rectangle, he means a right triangle. Equilateral, isosceles, nor scalene, but all and none of these at once, right? So the idea here is when we do geometry, when we go to Euclid, he has these claims about triangles. The internal angles of a triangle add to 180 degrees, 2 right angles. Well, that, he's saying, is not true of the abstract concept of triangularity. No, it's true of all the triangles, particular triangles, triangles that have a size, triangles that have a color, right? And so the idea here is that we don't deal with abstractions, we deal with generalities and those full objects. So unlike Locke, who wants to give us access just to the abstractions from which the mind then creates the particular object, he says, no, we see the objects and then we can group them together in various ways that are similar, and that will give rise to a general term, but that doesn't mean it's an abstract term. And what that does is something really interesting and important epistemologically, according to Berkeley, right? So notice what we just did with triangles. Instead of saying that we have the essence of the triangle and each particular triangle partakes of the form of the triangle, partakes of the essential, we are looking for eternal truths about some abstract notion of triangularity. No, we're talking about something that holds for every single member of the set of triangles. That is, for every actual or possible triangle that are real triangles. So in the realm of abstraction, if we make that move that Locke is ceding to Descartes and therefore to Plato and Aristotle, right? If we make that move to abstraction, that abstraction is an absolute essence, which we then derive from metaphysics, and we reason deductively downward, right? And that's exactly what we saw in Descartes, right? We start with these absolute general truths, and then we deductively move downward. But if we have this new understanding of general terms, according to Berkeley, where they aren't abstractions, but just sets of objects, now the entire approach to knowledge is different. In the realm of universals, on the other hand, if we start with particulars, then we have to reason upward towards generalizations. We see what's true of triangles. That's not a deductive argument down from abstraction. That's an inductive argument up from the properties of the particular. In making the move to abstraction, as Locke does, then that is tantamount to forfeiting the game to the rationalist. If Locke, the empiricist, is going to make the move to abstraction and we never observe abstraction, then you just gave the rationalists their big point, right? You don't observe it. Where is it coming from? Well, it must be innate, and now we can deductively derive down. So what he's saying is, Locke, you made a mistake right out of the gate, and that's going to cost us the game. If we make this new move, we have a completely different epistemic approach, one that's inductive, and that is how empiricism actually works. So, what do words actually mean? So, language, he says, is to blame for this move to abstraction. Why? Well, here's what he says. It will be objected that every name that has a definition is thereby restrained to one certain signification. It's one thing to keep a name constant to the same definition, and another to make it stand everywhere for the same idea. The one is necessary, the other useless and impracticable. So if you think of purple, you're not just thinking of purplitude, you're thinking of purple things. You're thinking of grapes. You're thinking of the t-shirt I'm wearing right now. You're thinking of another purple thing that's not coming to mind at the moment, right? The point is that you're thinking of particulars, not the abstract concept, right? And what he says is not every word has a definition. If language works, it ought to be universal. And he says there are a lot of philosophical concepts, or if we look at variables in algebra, that are in a certain sense undefined, right? But he says there's another problem, and that is we don't just use language to refer, to convey ideas, to put ideas in your head. We also use it to stir the passions, to encourage dispositions, right? Now, of course, Berkeley's going to say this, right? He's a bishop. He gives sermons. What do sermons do? The point of a sermon, a linguistic act, is not just to convey a fact. It's actually to do these other things, right? To make people passionate about belief, to encourage them to live good moral lives, right? And so the idea that philosophers have that language is just meant to code abstractions, well, that just doesn't seem to be what we actually use language for. In fact, he said, words can be a double-edged sword. It cannot be denied that words are of excellent use, and that by their means, all that stock of knowledge which has been purchased by the joint labors of inquisitive men in all ages and nations may be drawn into the view and made the possession of a single person, right? Language is amazing, right? You cool it is. Somebody else's ideas, by virtue of the fact that they're put into language, now can be your ideas. Whoa! But at the same time, it must be admitted that most parts of knowledge have been strangely perplexed and darkened by the abuse of words and the general ways of speech in which they are delivered. That is, that while language can be used to convey knowledge, it can also be used in a way that unnecessarily baffles. Okay, this passage in Berkeley is one of the reasons why a lot of the early analytic philosophers actually liked Berkeley a whole lot, because this is, sort of the line they took, which is that there are a lot of philosophical problems that sound like they're deep, eternal problems. Whoa, that's profound. No, it's not. You're just twisting the language in order to make something that sounds smart, but is actually really meaningless. And so what Berkeley is saying is that, yeah, we can use language in such a way that it conveys knowledge, but we can also use language in these other ways where it doesn't actually say anything, but seems to be giving us these deep puzzles that are really not puzzles at all. They're just flaws of language. So how do we avoid the word plague? How do we keep our language from deceiving us and making us think there are problems when there aren't really problems? He says, look, to avoid the problems that language deliver, he says, so long as I can find my thoughts to my own ideas divested of words, I don't see how I can be easily mistaken. The objects I consider I easily know. I cannot be deceived. It's not possible for me to imagine that any of my own ideas are alike or unalike that are not truly so. To discern the agreements and disagreements that are between my ideas, to see what ideas are included in any compound idea and what not, there is nothing more requisite than an attentive perception to what passes in my own understanding. Now, in a sense, that passage could have come right from Descartes' meditations, right? I mean, in a certain sense, that's exactly what Descartes says he wants to do. Let me look inside my own mind and see what's there. Berkeley's going to say, yeah, you know what? That's probably right, because what's inside my mind aren't words, but ideas. Right? We then take those ideas, we code them into words, and then we pass the words along to one another, and those words can do damage. As long as what I do is restrict myself just to the ideas in my own head, then I know I'm going to avoid the mistake. And so in this way, what we see is Berkeley's project being very Cartesian. So he's laid out a Cartesian sort of picture, right? I will only use those ideas that are within my mind, and then from those see how I can build up all of knowledge. So it's a sort of Cartesian project, even if it's not going to be done in a Cartesian way, right? What he's going to say is, let's launch. So that's the end of the introduction. Let's now start into part one. And he begins by saying, look, every idea that I have in my mind comes from one of three places. Most of them from the senses. Some of them are reflections on the working of the mind. I know when I'm confused. I know when I'm hungry. I know when I'm angry, right? I know when something is clear to me, right? Because my mind can think about itself. And then there's memory and imagination, right? I can imagine a unicorn. I can remember, back when we could teach in classrooms, right? And so he begins with a thoroughgoing empiricism. So while he has a Cartesian type project, the first thing that Descartes did was get rid of the senses. The first thing that Berkeley does is embrace the senses, right? In a very Lockean sort of way. And he says the existence of ideas entails the existence of mind, right? He has a sort of cogito moment, right? I think, therefore I am. Remember the existence of the self, the existence of the mind, the I as a thinking thing. And you see explicit reference to that in certain sections in this early part. So he is going to buy that Cartesian line. You can't have ideas without having a mind that has them. And so he'll agree that the mind exists. Right? If there exist ideas, there must exist a mind. Ideas do exist. So I know there is at least one mind in existence. But then he asks this question. What does it mean to say that something exists? What is existence? And here is probably the most famous passage on I say exists. That is, I see it and feel it. And if I were out of my study, I should say it existed, meaning by that, if I was in my study, I might perceive it, or that some other spirit, by spirit he means mind, does perceive it. For as to what is said of the absolute existence of unthinking things without any relation to their being perceived, that seems perfectly unintelligible. Their essay, that is existence, is percipi, that is to be perceived, nor is it possible they should have any existence out of the minds of thinking things that perceive them. And so the phrase esse est percipi, which is the Latin for this one, is the most famous phrase in all of Berkeley. If Berkeley had a car and that car had a bumper sticker, the bumper sticker on Berkeley's car would say esse est percipi. Well, not precipi, but percipi, right? The idea here is that to be is to be perceived, right? So there are two ways a thing can exist. One is to be a thinking thing, to be a mind. Minds exist, and we know this because they have ideas. But if you aren't a thing with consciousness, if you aren't a thinking thing, the only way you exist is to be the perception, the object of perception of something that does exist. So your computer only exists because you are looking at it. Your ceiling exists because when you look up, you see it. For a non-thinking thing to exist is for it to be the object of perception. And so again, I keep coming back to this point over and over again through the course, right? The hallmark of the modern period is that metaphysics comes from epistemology. Epistemology comes first, metaphysics comes second, right? And so we start with empiricism. We start with the epistemology, and from that we get the existence of things. From the epistemology we derive the metaphysics. So to be is to be perceived. What does this mean? Well, here's the big payoff, right? From what has been said, it shows that there is not any other substance than proof of this point. Let it be considered smell, taste, and qualities of a similar kind. That is, the ideas perceived by sense. Now, for an idea to exist in an unperceiving thing is a manifest contradiction. For to have an idea is all at one to perceive. That, therefore, in which color, figure, and the like qualities exist, must perceive them. Hence, it is clear that there can be no unthinking substance or substratum of those ideas. So if we are going to be empiricists, if we are going to say that all human knowledge comes from observation, then we must be prepared to give up on a material world. Right? Remember what I keep calling the central question of metaphysics. The central question of metaphysics is, look, I have all of these experiences, right? Right now you're looking at your computer, right? Where is that vision of the computer? It's not out there in your room, it's up in your mind, right? Think of that cartoon I always draw on the board, right? I draw, poorly drawn man, right? With an eye looking at a chair, and there's the cartoon bubble above his head that contains the chair, right? The idea here is all we have access to is what's in our cartoon bubble. All we have access to is what is in our mind. That's where the observation is the central question of metaphysics. How can I reason from what's in my mind to the existence of an external world that in any way resembles it? And what Berkeley is saying is, you can't. You cannot get outside your head. If we are going to be empiricists and say that all knowledge comes from observation, and observations are just in the mind, then all knowledge is purely knowledge about what is in the mind. Berkeley is a monist, and it's a form of monism called idealism. That is, all that exists are minds and the ideas they have. There is no material world. Who says there's a material world while trying to be an empiricist? Locke, right? Remember, Locke has this distinction that he takes great pains in order to justify between primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are those observed properties that actually exist in the body out there, right? Things like number, size, shape, right? Then there are secondary qualities which don't exist within the body, but exist within our idea of the body. Things like color or texture or smell or taste, right? These, Locke argues, are part of our idea of the thing. The lemon tastes sour. The lemon looks yellow, but the lemon isn't sour. The lemon isn't yellow. The primary qualities, the oblong shape, is actually part of the lemon. The lemon is solid, but it isn't really yellow. It just has the power to make me think sour when I taste it. All right. So the point for Locke of the primary secondary distinction is to decide which elements of the perception actually apply to the real object itself and which are just aspects of my internal experience. That presupposes dualism, right? It presupposes that there are ideas, and it presupposes that there is an external world and that they are different things. But Berkeley's going to say no. Ideas are ideas. It doesn't matter whether they come from one sense or two senses, right? It doesn't matter where they came from, how they got into the mind. The fact is, they are just mental things, right? This primary, secondary quality distinction that Locke is drawing, what does it do? It presupposes a dualism, that there is a metaphysically real but insensible substratum of materiality, right? He uses that term substratum all through this. And the idea here is that it is an underlying layer of reality to which we have access to the computer itself, only to some material substratum, right, in which there is some material object that is the computer, right? If to be is to be perceived, by this definition, the substratum can't be perceived, so why should we even think it exists? He says, hence it is plain that the very notion of what is called matter or corporeal substance involves a contradiction in it. What is the contradiction? Well, you're saying that there is an invisible thing that somehow is now visible to you, right? That something you can't think of, you will have a thought of. That, he thinks, is a contradiction. Now, Descartes, remember, is also a dualist. He gets us to the real world, right? And what he says, and we saw in Spinoza that this gets a big deal made of it, and the entire monadology in Leibniz is an attempt element, is for Descartes, remember, what is necessarily true are the clear and distinct ideas, and what gets him to an external world is the clear and distinct idea of extension, right? Extension is length or width or height, volume, area, right? That it's extended in space. And what he wants to say, Descartes, is that extension is the essence of matter. That to be a material thing is to be extended in space. That is, extension itself is materiality, which is how he arrives at his idea that space itself has to be an object, because I could measure the distance between 2 points, right? But how do we gain access to this notion of extension? Not through the senses, but pure reason, right? Again, remember, this is Descartes. But the only reason we could have an idea of extension, Berkeley says, is because I see things. And everything I see has a length, right? So there is no abstract concept of extension. I see objects with size, right? Your foot may be a size 10, right? Your computer screen might be, 13 inches on the diagonal, right? Things have size. That's where we get the notion of extension, right? So the idea is nothing but the sensation of it. So it isn't the case that we get dualism, right? Because we have some abstract notion of extension. No, in fact, what happens is that we have, in fact, a particular idea of it because of a set of particulars. So he says, material objects themselves are a contradiction. Existence of matter implies that we can, right? So you can only conceive of what's in your mind. When you look at your computer, there's the observation of the computer in your mind. And you're saying, well, but the real material computer is the thing I can't actually see, but the thing that's creating the image in my head. So you're trying to tell me that I can see an object I can't see, I can conceive of an object I can't conceive, I can perceive an object I can't perceive? No. That's self-contradictory. I can't get outside my head to some material world out there. And therefore, if I can't get there, to say that there is a there, how do you know there's a there if you can't get there? Material existence. The idea that matter exists in the world is itself inconsistent. It's contradictory. There is no material world. Well, that leaves Berkeley in one weird place, right? So if to be is to be perceived, is to be, an option, I also have imagination. Does that mean I can just imagine something into being? Right? This is the problem of the breakfast burrito, right? The idea is I can think of it, I can have the image in my mind, but I'm still hungry. I can't eat the darn thing, right? And what he needs to say is, look, there is a difference between those ideas I perceive and those ideas I imagine. And what's the difference? The difference is that one is the result of understanding, and the other is the result of volition, of the will. There is a fundamental difference between the ideas I get from the understanding and the ideas I get from the will, right? So I say to you, okay, think of a breakfast burrito, right? Now you've chosen to do that, right? You've used the will in order to bring into your mind some idea. That's very different from a perception, right? I want you to look at the computer screen in front of you. I now want you to see that computer screen as a hippopotamus. You can't do that, right? You can imagine a hippopotamus-shaped computer, but the things you observe that are direct perceptions are not open to the will, he says, right? The imagination only subject to the understanding, right? Suppose I say, I want you to see me from now on as 3 inches taller with a full head of hair and minus about 40 pounds. Well, it'd be really nice if you could all see me that way. 30 years ago, maybe you could have, right? But now you just can't. You see the Steve that is, right? The point is you see what you see. It isn't an act of will. You don't choose how you see it. It's just impressed upon the mind. And so for that reason, we can distinguish between the imagination and the perception. And so no, you can't just think something into existence. I mean, in a trivial sense, you can, right? Because the idea of the imaginary breakfast burrito does exist as an idea, but just as an idea of the imagination. It doesn't exist as an idea of the understanding. And so that leads us to the big question. Okay. So if all that exists are minds and the ideas that have them, and all of these minds have ideas that are not the result of their will, but are the result of perceptions and puts them in the understanding, and they all seem to agree about things. When we all look at a chair, we all go, yeah, it's a chair. How many legs? We all go, yeah, 4. What color? Well, that's blue. We all perceive the same thing. And yet there's no chair out there causing those? Why is it that we all see the same thing? And we do know this because we communicate, right? Now we run into, of course, the question, right? Well, how do I know that your yellow is my yellow, right? Well, the point is we both see it as yellow. We all agree that it's the same color as a lemon. And if I'm not looking at it, so let's take the chair. And we don't look at the chair. And we don't sit on the chair. So there is no perception of the chair. And to be is to be perceived. Does the chair exist? Right? A number of you have seen me do exactly this, right? This is from Berkeley. What I'll do is I'll pull a chair up to the front of the room and I'll ask, is there a chair? And people will hesitate. And I say, well, only in a philosophy class would you say, would you hesitate to answer that? And I'll then take the chair and I'll put it out in the hallway. Does the chair still exist? Well, if to be is to be perceived, and no one's perceiving it, does the chair still exist? Now, what's weird is every time I go back, the chair is still there, exactly where I left it. So that seems like it should exist whether I'm looking at it or not. But if to be is to be perceived, then when I'm not looking at it, the chair, bing, disappears out of existence. What? So how does the world still exist when we all go to sleep? When no one's perceiving it, why does it still exist? Right? And this is even weirder, he realizes, that it's not just individual perceptions. And this is sort of the hint, but that these perceptions are ordered, right? You've all seen me in class. What do I do over and over and over again? I drop the pen and the pen falls. I drop the pen falls. Drop the pen and the pen falls, right? There is an order, a structure to these observations that give rise to laws of nature, right? Berkeley doesn't want to deny that science works. Why is it that all of these observations are similar amongst people, that the things that I don't observe when I go back are still where I last observed them? And why did that let us do science? I mean, all that would make sense if there was a material world that actually operated a certain way, but Berkeley just spent all this time telling us there is no external material world. If everything is just ideas in the mind, why do we all have the same ideas in our minds, and why are they organized so well? Well, because ours are not the only mind there. There is another mind, a more important mind, a bigger mind, a better mind, the best mind. Remember, he's got a day job. He's a bishop. Who saves the day? God, right? God is all-knowing. God is all-present. Well, knowledge is perception. So if Berkeley is going to be an empiricist, to say that God is all-knowing and all-present, all that literally means is that the mind of God perceives everything all the time. So if the mind of God perceives everything all the time, does the chair disappear when I'm not looking at it? No. And here is a limerick that everyone reads when they're studying Berkeley. This was not written by Berkeley. This was written by a student at Oxford, whose name escapes me. But it basically sums up the entire Berkeleyan metaphysic. There was a young man who said God must find it exceedingly odd to think that the tree should continue to be when there's no one about in the quad. And the reply comes, dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad, and that's why the tree continues to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. An ever-present, ever-observing mind, God's mind, and that's why the chair continues to be when you stop looking at it. So that brings us back to the chart. We now have all the squares filled in. We now have our monist, who's an empiricist, and that is Berkeley. So dualism, monism, rationalism, empiricism, it turns out that while we have one argument in epistemology and another argument in metaphysics, is completely independent of the position you choose in the other. There are very intricate and interesting arguments for all four of these positions. Well, that leaves us with two thinkers left for the semester, Hume and Kant. Hume, we'll see next time, is going to try to blow up the chart. Kant is going to try to be the chart. So with that, for next time, please read the first part of the Hume reading. See you then.
Thank you so much, Steve.